Hello and welcome to the Christ Baptist Church devotional going through the book of Genesis. It's going to be a study of Genesis, but it's not going to be a detailed study. It's just that we've done so many books of the Bible already in the Old Testament. We've gone through the book of Jonah, the book of Daniel, Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, and Malachi to cover all the time that Israel went into captivity and came out to rebuild the temple and the city up to the time of our Lord Jesus Christ. And now we're into the book of Genesis. And we've covered Genesis chapter 1 to 11, which is really a key battleground for the Christian faith. The idea of really what happened at the beginning when God has kept it from us. Scientifically, we can't find out what happened. We've got some amazing understanding of how the Bible records not only how God created the heavens and the earth, but the fact that people lived so very long before the flood and even just after the flood. They lived long, although the ages started coming down some. We saw that in Genesis chapter 11. And we saw that there was a global flood, which is critical to the Christian faith. 2 Peter chapter 3 tells us this in the first 6 or 7 verses about how critical it is. And it's for us anticipating the return of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we need to do it by understanding how in the days preceding, God flooded the earth to just purify the earth because it's judgment. It's a sign of judgment that is coming. And we saw that with Enoch and naming Methuselah and all of those accounts that took place. But there was a global flood, and what came out of that flood was a boat with 8 people, and they repopulated the earth. And so very quickly, not maybe 120 years or so afterwards, they decided to band together, follow a man named Nimrod, and just deny God and build their own tower, reaching up into heaven if they could, and just to forget God altogether. And the people who came off of that boat were still alive during that time. Difficult to believe, but it shows you the power of sin that makes us want to run away from God and not run to God because of his goodness. We run away because we don't believe he's good for us, and we want to achieve our own goodness. And that's what happened in the Tower of Babel. Well, as we went through and got up to the time of Abraham, we just showed how in Genesis 11, the people wanted to make their name great. We saw that in verse 4 of chapter 11. They want to make for ourselves a name. But then we come to chapter 12, and that's really not what God has planned. We're not going to be so great. We're not going to invent so many things we make our name great. Oh no, that's not what God's plan is. God's plan is the exact opposite. That you are driven to humility, and then he will make your name great. We're going to see that here in chapter 12 as well. And one of the main things to look for here in chapter 12 is how God works by grace, 100%, divine grace by 100% in that how he selects and chooses people. And when people are confronted by the living God, they're changed and they obey, but it doesn't make them now able to battle sin and to be immune from sin the rest of their life. No, it's not. We're going to see Abraham here, who was chosen by God, and he follows God and does some good things, but at the same time, he's susceptible to fear and sin and doesn't believe that God is good. And so he will react in fear, and we're going to see how God deals with that. But really what's going to happen is we're going to see it in the later chapters, how it really shows itself in danger. And so it starts with very small sins that don't seem like as big a deal. You work your way out. It seems like everything's okay, but there's a pattern that will emerge that creates a danger later. Well, let's pick it up here in verse 27 of chapter 11. That is really where the father of Abram comes in. His name is Terah. Let's start there, chapter 11, verse 27. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. So there are 3 brothers. Abram, now notice it's not Abraham, it's Abram, but it's the same man. Nahor and Haran, his brother. And now Haran, we're told, is actually the father of a young man named Lot. So Lot actually is the nephew of Abram. It's his brother's son. Verse 28, Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. So Haran, he died early. We don't know how old he was when he died, but we do know that he died there in Ur. Verse 29, Abram and Nahor are the two brothers that were left. They took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. So Abram, his wife was Sarai. We're going to find something interesting about Abram's wife as well. But he took her wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Now, Milcah was the daughter of Haran. And it appears as though that is the same Haran, that's his brother. And he's the father of Milcah and Iscah. Could be different. Could be different because we know that his brother Haran had Lot. This could be a different Haran, but it was listed there. We don't know for sure. So they're all tightly related here. So Abram and Nahor, the two remaining brothers, have wives. Sarai, verse 30 says, was barren. She had no child. So Sarai, again, it's not Sarah, it's Sarai, that's her name. And she is not able to produce children. Verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, so that's Terah's grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and settled there. So they left Ur and they went down to a place called Haran, which is moving toward Canaan. They wanted to get there to enter the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and they settled there. I know that the name of the town Haran, or the region Haran, is the same name as the brother that died. I understand that. They got the same name. It's okay. But they went as far as a place called Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So one thing we notice, Terah died at 205 years. That's a lot shorter than all the people who lived so many more years at all. And so we know that Shem was 102 years old when he had Arphaxad, and he lived another 500 years after that. And so Arphaxad lived 403 years after he lived 35 years. So now we're living 500. But remember, before the flood, people lived 900 years, and we're slowly coming down to 800, 700 years. After the flood, now we see the people who were living that came out of the boat after the flood. We don't have records of Japheth and Ham coming out after the flood, other than Genesis 10. But what we see is in these years here, people are living now 500 years, 600 years, and they're slowly coming down. We get down to Terah, and they live now 205 years. So we're down pretty far. It's coming down as planned. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So Terah's now dying in Haran. That's the father of Abram. A couple of things that I want you to know that are important to understand. In Acts chapter 7, verse 4, Stephen has a sermon that he's talking about the history of Israel. He's talking about Abram. And in Acts chapter 7, verse 4, he's talking about now Abram, calling him Abraham here in Acts, and saying that God told him to leave your country and come into a land that I'll show you. In Acts chapter 7, verse 4, he says, then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you're now living. So mark that, it's important. They left Haran, but after his father died, not before. So after his father died, Abram decides to say, well, let's leave Haran and start going into Canaan. And so he went to Canaan then, and we see that from Acts chapter 7, verse 4. Now, what we're learning right here is that after that one little piece of information, you just kind of note that, and I'm going to come back to it. But here we get this idea that the generations of Terah, He comes down, he lived 205 years. Now, what did we learn on the last devotion? What we learned is that Terah was raising Abram and his two brothers. In Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." So Terah and his family were living in Ur of the Chaldeans, and they were serving other gods. They didn't want anything to do with the God of Israel because there was no Israel at that time, but the God who flooded the earth. Remember, this is only a couple hundred years maximum after the flood. We're not talking very long here. 200-300 years maybe. Very soon after the flood, now we have people that are worshiping gods other than the God who flooded the earth. It's hard to believe. They didn't want to admit and submit to the God that is dealing with them on a daily basis. So they were serving other gods. They were idolaters. So now that's the situation. There's Terah, and he's got his three sons, grandsons, and they're serving other gods. And then Genesis 12 kicks in. Now the Lord said to Abram, we don't know why. There's no reason why. There's nothing Abram did. There's nothing that Abram was pursuing God at all. He's an idolater. But out of nowhere, we see God's grace coming right down into Abram's life and dealing with him directly. Speaks to him. We don't know how he spoke to him. We don't know if it's audible. We don't know if it was just through his spirit. We have no idea. We just says, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. See, there's the difference between that and Genesis 11, verse 4, where the people wanted to make their name great by doing great things. Here's somebody who's an idolater, doesn't want anything to do with God, going nowhere, in the middle of the wilderness there with his family, and then God shows up to him and says, I'm going to make your name great, Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, from your relatives, leave to the land which I will show you. In other words, have faith that the land I'm going to show you is better than what you can imagine. See, what's the key component here? You trust that I am good. And how do you trust that I'm good? Because I've got blessings coming, and I'm telling you about them if you obey. So come to the land which I'm going to show you, and I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, and so you'll be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so he says he's going to make him a name great, and he tells them a few things. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. That means there's going to be a lot of people. What's the problem? The problem is Sarai can't have children. How can you be a great nation if your wife can't have children? Because we understand that she was barren, chapter 11, verse 30. So she's barren, and he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you personally. I'm going to make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. You're going to be a blessing to so many people. And I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I'll curse. Now let me give you a literal Hebrew rendering of this. Sometimes it's helpful to get a little bit of more accurate Hebrew presentation here. He says, I'm going to bless the one who blesses you. He uses the exact same word, the word barak. I'm going to bless the one who blesses you. Okay, that's good. But then the next one he says, and the one who curses you I will curse. But then it's a little bit different here. He doesn't use the same word for curse. He says, the one who treats you lightly, I will curse. The one who doesn't give you respect, I will curse. It's actually the word light, to be found light. It's the word that would say, you put on a scale and it's light. And let me give you a picture of this. It's the same word we learned long ago in the book of Daniel, when Daniel saw the handwriting on the wall, and it says, Mene, tekel, upharsin. It's the word tekel right here. You've been found light or found wanting on the scales of God, and now you're going to be divided. That's what Daniel had. Here, the one who treats you lightly, I will curse. That's different. You don't even have to curse Abraham to get God's curse. All you have to do is not treat him with respect, not treat him with weight, not treat him with the importance that he deserves, because he has God's blessing on him. So the one who ignores Abraham is going to be in big trouble, not just cursing him. So he says, and I will, the one who curses you, the one who treats you lightly, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In you, through you, and that's going to be coming up in Genesis chapter 15. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So he just tells them that. That's just, there it is. He's an idolater. He doesn't deserve anything. He's not worshiping God. He just tells them that. So that's what we have. He makes him some promises, various promises that are going to Abraham and to Abraham's offspring. So verse 4, so Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Oh, that's important information. Let me draw now the connections to you. We have some facts here. Genesis 12, verse 4. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. We know that. Okay. We know from Acts chapter 7, verse 4, that he left Haran when his father died. He left Haran when his father died. Well, when did his father die? Well, we know from Genesis 11:32, his father died when he was 205 years. So take 205 minus 75. Abram was born when Terah was 130 years old. To give you an idea that they still were having babies after 100 years. So Abram was actually born when Terah was 130 years old. Lived 75 years. After his father died, that's what Acts chapter 7, verse 4 says. Now, leave, go. And when he did, he left to go to the land of Canaan. He left Haran to do that. So, verse 5, Abram took Sarai's wife and Lot his nephew and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Verse 6, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. So we know that Canaan and his offspring were now living in the land. They had migrated there, and they've gone there. This is after the nations had split. This is after the geography of the nations had split around, and they'd come around, and so the Canaanite clan was all in this area. Remember, the Canaanites were the ones that were cursed by Noah. So they're in the land. That's just a little note to tell us that's who's there. But the land is promised to Canaan. God says, I want you to go to Canaan. That's where I want you to go. I want you to get up and go to a land I'm going to show you. And so he tells them they left Haran and they came to the land of Canaan. Verse 7, now the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. There's the promise right there. The promise to Abram's descendants. To all of them, we're going to see. Not to all of them, but to some descendants I'm going to give to you this land. But for sure to your descendants and not to anybody else's descendants. No other descendants get this land. Abram gets this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So land becomes a very big issue in Genesis, as it does throughout the rest of the Bible, as it does even today. It's a huge issue. The Middle East, they're fighting over land. You've got people fighting over the West Bank. They're called, people called the Palestinians, people called the Arabs, people called Israel. What is this all about? Well, it's all fight about the land. And Israel is saying this is our land that God had promised to us. The world keeps saying, no, it's not. The Palestinians were there when you were. No, they weren't. These are the first people that were there. God told them to take the Canaanites and kill them all. This is your land. So basically, all the way from the Bible, even till today in politics, land is the issue, as it is here in Genesis. And here it is in Genesis 12, verse 7. He says, to your descendants, I'm going to give this land. So Abram builds an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. So when you think of politics and you think of what's going on and Palestinians, free the Palestinians and all of that, you got to look a little deeper than just the political slogans that are out there. and find out what does God say about this and what is true. Verse 8, then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And so now he's building an altar and calling upon the name of the Lord, just like the men did under the time of Enosh. And then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now he's building an altar and he's worshiping the Lord who's telling him to go to the land of promise. Verse 9, Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. Negev is kind of toward Egypt. It's going down toward that desert area, toward the Nile River. That's where he's journeying. So Abram, he was chosen by God, given grace by God, out of nowhere. This is the picture of God's goodness. He takes somebody who's an idolater, deserving of nothing, out of all the people of Nimrod that are creating all kinds of chaos, and he just intervenes in Abram's life. He just intervenes and says, I want to bless you and make your name great. Abram says, okay, you've connected. I see you're the living God. I'm going to do this. And he in his best as he can, in his mind's eye, he forsakes his gods, and he goes. When his father dies, he goes. And then he sets up an altar to worship. He didn't know how to worship God. He didn't know anything about that. He didn't grow up worshiping God. He grew up as an idolater. He served other gods. But he makes an altar as best he can and says, I'm going to worship that God. And God says, to your people, your descendants, I'm going to give this land. So Abram carries on. Well, that's an amazing thing. God chooses somebody, God blesses somebody, and now they have a relationship. God and Abram have this relationship, and they're so connected. Does that keep Abram from sin? Hardly. Hardly. Look here now in verse 10. Here's our first story that comes from verses 10 to 20. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So he goes out of the land of Canaan to get to Egypt because he hears there's food there. You got to get out. I mean, God said stay in Canaan, but when you're starving, you got to go do something. So he did. And when the Egyptians, and that said in verse 11, it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you're a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they'll kill me, but they'll let you live. I'll tell you, she must have been really stunning, beautiful. Why is that? Well, because Abram left Haran at 75. So it's now at least a few more years after that. I know that Sarai was 10 years younger, so she's 65, 66, 67, going on 70, and he's so concerned about how stunning she looks. He's got to protect himself because he knows the Egyptians are going to be all over. She is so beautiful. That's amazing. You're in your 60s and your 70s, and you're considered to be a supermodel because you're so concerned about how people are going to treat you when you go to a foreign country. And he says to her, he says, I know you're a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they'll say this is his wife, and they'll kill me, but they'll let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. He starts to say, just say you're my sister. Let's work this out between you and me. Because they're going to kill me as soon as they see you. Because they'll see you're my wife, they know they can't have you, and they'll kill me because they want you. Well, I can't believe that Sarah went along with it. I can't believe Abraham actually came up with this idea. Not trusting God at all is a problem. Well, let's just see how it plays out here. Verse 14, it came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Again, she must have been a stunning supermodel. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. So again, here comes all of the wealth from Egypt now to Abram. Now what did God say? I'll make your name great. I'm going to bless you. The one who curses you, I'm going to curse. The one who blesses you, I'm going to bless. And so he says that. Abram here creates a bunch of nonsense by telling people his wife is actually his sister. And what ends up happening? what ends up happening is Pharaoh treats Abraham so well, he gives him all kinds of servants, donkeys, oxen, everything. He's blessing Abram. Ultimately, God sovereignly is causing Pharaoh to bless Abram. But verse 17, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Why? You're not going to defile this woman. She's the wife of Abram. And in her seed is going to be all the land going to Canaan, which is from Abram's descendants, not from you, Pharaoh. So the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with a great plague. We don't know what those plagues were. We don't know what happened. But all of a sudden we know everybody's got a problem as soon as Sarai came into the house. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Verse 19, why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and go. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him, which was a bunch of stuff that Pharaoh gave him. Now, you look at this, you say, wow, that was kind of a bad thing. Yeah, and Abram was trying to be clever by more than half, because he didn't do this just once. He did it later, we're going to see. But I'll just give you the clue right here. In Genesis 20, verse 12, Abram says, talking about Sarai, he says, besides, she actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So Sarai is Abram's half-sister, biologically. His father, Terah, through a different woman, a different wife or a different woman, had Sarai. We didn't learn that in chapter 11. We learned it in chapter 20. And so we see this family business in chapter 11:31, that Sarai is one that was taken by Abram, but she was actually the daughter of his dad, Terah, and some other woman. And so she technically is his sister. So Abram was trying to be real clever and say, tell her she's my sister, which she kind of is, but she's also my wife. See, he was trying to be clever with that. And it caused some problems because no doubt he was stressing over the fact that he gave her to Pharaoh. And what he didn't understand was God said, I'm promising to give you this land for all your descendants, but your descendants, not Pharaoh's descendants. It's not going to be just because they came out of Sarai. They got to come from your seed, Abraham. You're the one with the seed, and you're going to impregnate Sarai, and she's going to have children, but they're going to be your children. They get the land, not Pharaoh's kids. So you don't give your wife to somebody else because I made a promise that's going to involve her. You protect her in that way. But you know what God did? Abraham, he sinned in this way, lying and not trusting in God's goodness that God would protect him and God would protect Sarai. He didn't believe that, so he came up with his own plan. And we're going to see how that sin, even though God overlooked it here, God didn't tell Abraham, now you sinned, I'm going to teach you. He didn't do that. He didn't say anything about it. But what's going to happen is going to be one of the greatest sins that is going to be, well, it's a sin that even has effect today, because Abraham did not learn to trust God with a very, very small thing. And so then when it really counted, it became a huge problem, and it's been a problem for Israel ever since. That's a problem even today. And so God here didn't just correct this sin, but what he did do was he kept his promise even when Abram was in sin. He kept his promise. What great comfort we have when we are born again, when we're saved, when we come face to face with the living God. We realize we're sinners and we can be saved by grace through the act of Christ. You know what this says? It says God's grace and his promise still applies when we're in sin and we continue to sin. I can rely on God's forgiveness. I can rely on God's promise. This doesn't mean sin doesn't have consequences. Sure it does. If I continue to sin or I have a sin that I haven't checked, it's going to show up later in life and it's going to cost on this earth. But it doesn't change who God is, and it doesn't change how he treats you. As he has chosen to put his grace on you, that doesn't stop. Sure, he'll discipline. Sure, he'll see that consequences happen, but as we're going to see in Abram's life. But what did happen here? Pharaoh turned and gave all his stuff to Abram because God's promise is true. So God took an idolater, somebody who didn't know anything about God, was running away from God, the true God. God took that one and just said, I'm going to give you my grace and show you my goodness and give you my goodness, even in the midst of sin. Even in the midst when he can't hold on in fear and not trusting in God's goodness, God's promise still is there. What a great picture for the rest of the Bible for us to understand. God's grace on sinners, that he promises, and he fulfills his promise, even though we still are trapped in sin, and we experience some of the results and the consequences of those sin. But our God stands as a very good God. That's what we see here in Genesis chapter 12. I hope you join us for the next devotion in Genesis chapter 13. We'll see you there.